state, now it's only fields and trees. Where was the time? Now it's nothing but flowers, the highways and cars were sacrificed for agriculture.
Thanks, everybody. And credit for that video goes to John Henry Bemis, Nancy Bemis' son. He put together a first version of that when we had our sculpture trail kickoff in 2020, and sort of adapted it with some updated photos and other photos of really all the things that you all make possible as supporters of the Land Trust. So with that, we are going to get started on the business portion of the meeting. I will introduce Tom.
Thank you. Good evening, all. I'd like to welcome you all to the 54th annual membership meeting of the Canaan Land Trust. I would like to offer a special welcome to this evening's guest speaker, Dr. Spencer Meyer of the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. I'm Tom Cronin, and I have the privilege of serving as the current board president. I'd like to begin by thanking our staff, our board members, our volunteers, and our entire membership for the support you provide this organization. I wish I could be there tonight, but COVID has sort of changed my schedule a little bit, and I found myself having to travel out of the country. But I'll do my best here remotely to manage the meeting. So with that, I'd like to now call the meeting to order this Wednesday, the 10th of November. Our first order of business is to elect 2 members to the board, Ainsley Hayes and Noel Cotton, and to re-elect board member Beth Sanford to another 4-year term. So I'd like to now ask the board members present for a motion to elect Ainsley Hayes and Noel Cotton to the board of the Canaan Land Trust and to re-elect Beth Sanford. Do I have a motion? Do I have a second?
Motion from Chris and a second from Art.
Thank you, Art. Thank you, Chris. All in favor, say aye. Terrific. Thank you very much. Congratulations, Ainsley, Noel, and Beth. That concludes the short portion of our official business. And now I'd like to just move on to some brief comments before handing off the meeting to our treasurer, Art Berry. Last year has shown us that our community benefits a great deal from our land conservation in many different ways. Land conservation provides a place to explore, to recreate, and to relax. Places to reconnect with nature, and places to learn and give back. But beyond what are viewed as the traditional benefits of open space, our efforts are also conserving green infrastructure that helps to reduce the impact of our changing climate. Take, for instance, the 2 severe rainstorms we've had in the last 2 months. Our open space preserves provide 0 impervious surface area compared to 30 to 50% impervious surface area in a medium density residential area. That impervious area results in 30% runoff, which is 3 times the runoff in open space. And as we know, our natural preserves help sequester carbon and ensure it remains on our landscape. So, how can we continue to conserve more land for the benefit of the community? Well, it really begins with our 2020 to 2040 strategic conservation plan, which calls for the doubling of our rate of land conservation to 400 additional acres by 2040. We believe this is a realistic goal and hope to begin to make progress towards this goal, particularly now when homes are selling and opportunities arise for transactions that allow for conservation opportunities. The Land Trust is prepared to address these opportunities progressively. And of course, we will continue to support and serve our community through the stewardship of our existing reserves and our pollinator pathways and our connection to the Green Link and our continued educational efforts as we come back from this COVID crisis period and begin to reconnect again. So again, I would like to thank you all for attending tonight and for your continued support. And I'd now like to turn over the meeting to Mark Berry, our treasurer, for an update on our finances. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, I'm glad I don't have to compete with the tree frogs. I think if you would say anything else, but every cloud has a silver lining. This is what the COVID did for us in terms of membership, plus our continued activities. I mean, you can't quantify which was which, but we got a lot of people outside, a lot of people spending more time outside, a lot of people introducing their families outside, and it was probably the best thing we could have had in hindsight. That's over 20% increase year to year, and you would have never guessed that if you had known what was coming. So we're very delighted about that, and it shows up in a number of ways here. If people can read that, revenue and expenses, we had a great year revenue-wise, and we managed to put a couple dollars in the bank, and it just was a good year in hindsight, I think, in terms of the land trust. That was probably the wrong thing. Anyway, if anybody has any questions about revenue or expense, obviously they can direct them to me or to Aaron. And here's where we stand at the moment. Our fiscal year ends on May 31st, and these are audited statements showing our cash and investments, and also our market value at that time of the funds we have with the New Canaan Community Foundation. We have given, in 3 stages, we've given $300,000 for them to commingle with the other nonprofits and manage for us. And this figure as of May 31st is before we put the last, most recent $100,000 in. And basically that shows if you take $200,000 and subtract it from the 333,000, you see that we've gotten off to a pretty good start. This was designed initially, the idea came up for having some long-term reserves. And then we became accredited with a national organization called the Land Trust Alliance, which works with just about 1,000 land trusts. It's a 3-year process. And Aaron is actually only 18 years old, but this is how old he looks after this. But he did a great job on this. And, it forces us to kind of stick to our knitting. And so I think that's, we got some money from the federal government, of course. They gave it to everybody. And so those loans will not appear in the future on the statement of financial position. But I think also you should always keep in mind that 10 years ago or 9 years ago, whenever our fiscal year showed revenue of about $8,000 to $9,000. So it's dramatically changed for the better. And we're doing a better job of getting our message out, I think, and exposing what we do to the community, which is really the thing. We've got a great board, and the last 4 or 5 years, we've added some terrific people, and conscientious, hardworking, and getting some results. So if there's any questions, let me know. I should turn it over to you, I guess, and let you.
Thanks, Art.
You got a soft shoe coming up.
Terrific. So again, I'm Aaron Lefland, the Executive Director of the Land Trust. When I was putting together this slideshow, I was looking back at old photos from the past couple of years, trying to find good fits for what we were going to talk about tonight, and came across this one, which was the last real thing we did before the pandemic set in. This was a great community partnership that we did in partner with our pollinator pathway friends and a number of the other sort of environmental groups in town, where we had Doug Tallamy, the author of Nature's Best Hope, come and deliver a talk about sort of how we can all take a more proactive approach in managing our landscape for habitat and wildlife and pollinators. And I think it just really illustrates how we brought the community together and work together towards common goals and to create impact and have reach. And then the pandemic hit and things slowed down for a bit, but we adapted. We had a lot of really neat events. We made do. We socially distanced. We masked up. We have photos here of a snowshoeing walk that we did on a nice snowy day, an outdoor poetry reading with the Connecticut State Poet Laureate, and a virtual wildlife release that we did for South School. So the kids were in the classroom tuning in while we released the injured hawk back to the rehabilitated hawk back to our preserves. So yeah, we adapted, and we also tried some new things. We created the New Canaan Sculpture Trail, which we didn't intend for it to be this sort of silver lining during the pandemic. We came up with the idea before the onset, but it turned out to be this remarkable way for people to get outside and do something while everything else was closed. And that something happened to be a really impressive tour of some incredible sculptures from local artists from around the region. The good news is we're planning another sculpture trail event. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But we continued to do other things. We kept our trails open. While everything was closed down, our trails saw more visitors than ever before. It was this sort of just this outlet for people to get outside into nature, to get away from Zoom calls and from virtual learning, and to get out and reconnect with the woods and meadows. And we not only kept the trails open, we built new trails. The photo on the right is the bridge at our new Owen Oak Lane Green Link, which we opened for the first time to the public with this trail. And we continued some of our normal things like caring for the land. We've got photos here of rebuilding stone walls, the new property signs that I'm sure many of you have seen at the properties across town, and then continuing to do things like habitat restoration. The photo down below was taken just a few weeks ago when we finished the last phase of planting at the Silvermine Fowler Preserve, where we planted, I think it was 2,000 plugs of ornament or of native grasses and flowers, and then another 175 shrubs that'll all bloom at various times of the year and provide habitat. So our commitment to caring for the properties that we own went unwavered. We also stood up for nature when it was threatened. For those that are familiar with this project, we and the Norwalk River Watershed Association worked together to try to protect the banks of the Silvermine River at the group's reservoir. And we intervened in a hearing process that didn't go the way we wanted to. Unfortunately, the project was approved by the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. But we're going to continue monitoring this and making sure that any impacts to the adjacent property, which is the Land Trust's Brown Preserve, are documented and then eventually mitigated. So we're going to continue to stand up for nature when it's threatened. And we continue to engage our community through volunteer days, through internship programs, and through all the great events that many of you have attended with us in the past. And all this is thanks to you. As our supporters, you sustain the Land Trust. And not only that, you're now helping us to come back stronger from this past couple of years. That's happening by allowing us to grow our talented team. Those of you who have been out on the preserves may have met Mike Pazareskis. He's our seasonal land steward. He'll be wrapping up his time with us probably in the next month or so. But he's done everything from mowing trails to installing little maps around the properties, helping us rebuild walls, taking care of downed trees, you name it, he's been on top of it. And then we're also really excited to introduce Rebecca Ross, who's in the back here with us. You probably met her on the way in. Rebecca joined our team September, I believe, as a TerraCore service member. So it's part of an AmeriCorps program. And she's serving with us as a community engagement coordinator. So helping to plan events like this and other things. She's going to be taking a leading role on planning the sculpture trail project that we have planned for 2022, increasing volunteer opportunities, and all the other things that sort of help our community interact with the Land Trust in meaningful ways. The other big thing we're looking towards is finding a permanent home. This is a photo of Greenwich Land Trust's headquarters up in Mueller Preserve, and we're looking for something like this. Land trusts are sort of uniquely positioned in that we have a mission of protecting land forever. And in order for us to do something forever, it probably makes sense for us to have a permanent home where we can not only just have meetings and keep our files, but meet with prospective landowners and just have a place to call home as we do all this important work over the next infinite number of years. Tom touched on this a little bit, but we're also looking to conserve new lands. This is sort of just an illustration of that strategic conservation plan that he mentioned. We have copies of it outside if you're interested, but we took these multiple data sets with different data layers, all these different sort of conservation information, whether it be the presence of wetlands or location to near trails or intact forests, and we kind of layered those all on top of one another and created this map where dark green areas are sort of our highest priority areas of conservation. And so we're taking a much more active approach on those high priority areas. Those are the areas we're focusing our energy. Those are the lands where we're having conversations with landowners in attempts to try to conserve as much of that land as possible before it's further developed or sold. And then lastly, we're going to be using land as a tool for change. And I hate slides with a lot of words, but it's hard to find pictures of things that are going to happen in the future. So the first thing is just creating more equitable access to nature and the outdoors. And so making our properties more accessible, maybe to folks with limited mobility or to folks with strollers, to be able to get out there and enjoy nature the same way that I do. We're also working to develop more partnerships and to increase our reach and impact. One of the really neat things I think the Land Trust has done is partner with organizations that don't necessarily have an environmental focus to them. And the Sculpture Trail was a really, really neat example of that, where Carriage Barn Art Center and the Land Trust came together to create something really special and really unique for our community. So I mentioned before that we are planning a 2022 Sculpture Trail, and our theme for next year's Sculpture Trail is open space for everybody. So kind of reinvigorating that notion that everybody should have access to the outdoors, whether that be people in our community, people from outside our community, being able to bring different groups together to enjoy all that nature has to offer. The other thing we're going to be doing is modeling sustainable land management for others. I talked a little bit about the Silvermine Fallow Preserve. Our sort of end vision for that is to use it as a demonstration site where people can say, oh, I've got an acre of lawn. Maybe I can do something creative with that and create something like what's at the Silvermine Fallow Preserve by planting native things and native grasses, native flowers and perennials, and really transform lawns, which are sort of ecological deserts, into something that has value for the natural world, and sort of continuing off of that theme of what Doug Tallamy's talk was all about a year and a half ago. We're also doing work to learn more and honor the history of our lands and learn about not only sort of who owned the land before us, but also the indigenous cultures that lived there and hunted there or gathered there, and honor that history and some of the complexities that are involved with that. And then lastly, this is another thing Tom alluded to in his presentation, is just safeguarding the green infrastructure. And I'm not going to talk too much about that because I think that's what Spencer's presentation focuses a bit on. But we've all seen just this enormous increase in just severe storms happening. It seems like we have 200-year storms happening twice a year now. And our preserves are sequestering rainwater and capturing rainwater so that flooding isn't as severe around town. They're sequestering carbon and just doing a ton of other things sort of behind the scenes to keep our town safe and livable. So we're going to continue to protect those conservation values. And so with that, I just want to thank you again, because you're what makes it possible. Your support is what allows us to do our great work. So thank you for being part of our past success and our hopeful future success as well. Happy to take any questions. Yeah, question.
What are the fundraising needs to purchase permanent property?
It's a good question. I'm just going to repeat that for our virtual audience. The question was sort of what fundraising needs are necessary for creating some sort of permanent home. We're still exploring what that looks like, whether it be, it's hard to say without knowing exactly what the project is. And we do anticipate it being significant. And once we have that information, definitely sort of make our supporters aware of it in ways that they can support that. We're fortunate to have some really great sort of family foundations and general foundations that can sort of be our lead donors on projects like that to kind of kickstart the giving. But we will be probably at some point in the future reaching out to our supporters for help with either that or another major land acquisition. Yeah.
Is the Norwalk Water Company house at the upper end of Valley Road still on the list of possibilities?
Again, so for our virtual audience, the question was, are we exploring, or is the group's house on Valley Road a potential opportunity for us for headquarters? I think it's a possibility. The problem is we don't have a willing seller. We did make an offer on the house. Was it about a year and a half ago? And they're basically asking for twice the appraised value. And it's just there's no negotiation there. So depending on the timing and maybe when that comes back on the market, it may be a possibility for us. But yeah, that's all I can really say about that. All right. I'm very pleased to welcome Spencer Meyer, our guest speaker this evening. So Spencer leads Highstead's conservation finance program by collaborating with partners throughout New England and the U.S. to develop strategies to advocate and advance for land conservation, climate mitigation, and watershed protection. As an interdisciplinary scientist with expertise in land conservation finance, Spencer's work blends the conservation and economics of the natural resources on which we all depend. Spencer's a co-founder of the Sebago Clean Waters and an active leader in the Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative and the Conservation Finance Network. He has a PhD and MS degrees from the University of Maine, an AB from Dartmouth, and I believe a postdoc at Yale. Okay, that's the connection. Okay, so without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Spencer.
Thank you for the welcome, Aaron. It's really great to be here with all of you this evening. Aaron and I have a couple of connections. Aaron was an intern at Highstead Foundation, actually right before I got there. So I don't think we met there, but so Aaron did a lot of great work when he was at Highstead with us through our internship program. And then we connected when he was at Yale and I was a postdoc at the Yale, now called the School of the Environment and Center for Business and the Environment, where I still collaborate, but I don't work there, as was mentioned earlier. But so it's great to have seen Aaron evolve and take on and grow into this role. And having looked at your new strategic conservation plan that Aaron sent me a while ago, and I saw a slide, it is such an impressive body of work that Aaron and all of you have done together. And having met Aaron earlier in his career and seeing now what you've all done together, he's done leading for you is really very impressive. So you're lucky to have a great leader here. So thank you for having me. So my primary role is at the Highstead Foundation, which is a physical place in Reading, Connecticut, not too far up the road. I also have an appointment at Harvard Forest, and I've already had 2 people tonight ask me about that connection. So it's great to meet connections with all of you. I don't live in Reading, though. I live in Guilford, Connecticut, on east of New Haven on Long Island Sound, and that's where I spend most of my time. I do travel, particularly pre-COVID, all around New England because at Highstead, our mission is really about conserving and helping steward landscapes and protecting land with partners all throughout New England. So we work from very northern Maine on down through this part of the region and a little bit in eastern New York. So we have a sort of broad geographic focus. We're not a land trust, though. We're a conservation nonprofit. We're a family operating foundation structure. We have our own endowments, so we're self-funded, but we work a lot with partners of land trusts and community organizations and big and small NGOs, really bringing together the groups of people through what we call regional conservation partnerships to do this kind of work and exactly this kind of thing you're doing here in New Canaan. We work with folks to help them do it all over the place. So earlier in the beautiful slideshow, there were a lot of photographs of really cool critters in the woods. And many of us got into this work, got into volunteering with land trusts or got into this work because of the critters and because of plants and because of trees and love of being in nature and exploring. And that is all very true for me too. I'm an ecologist by training and a forester by training. But this is the kind of critter I'm going to talk to you mostly about tonight. My kids and my friends' kids and all of your kids and grandkids enjoy these places, whether it's close to their home or whether it's far away in the hinterlands. So these places are important to us, not only for the critters and the plants and the trees and all that, but also for all of us and for our kids and for the livelihoods that we have. And so I'm going to talk a lot about some of these other benefits, but I don't want you to think all the conservation isn't still important for all those other kinds of biodiversity benefits. That is understood throughout the evening when we talk about many of these other things. So don't lose sight of those, please. And importantly, we are here focused on the woods surrounding our homes and our town and the local trails and all that. But it's important that we always remember we are part of something much bigger. These are the vast forests of North America. And so the forests that we have right here in New Canaan and in Connecticut and New England and America and North America are all part of this global system. And many of the things we're going to talk about, including climate change, are very much global processes. And so anything we do here, while it seems really small, and sometimes we wonder if it makes a difference, it is part of this global system. And so you have to always think about when you're stewarding a piece of trail or a piece of property or a wetland or meadow near your house, you're doing something that's much bigger. It's part of the much bigger whole. The challenge comes from the things that we worry about at Highstead, and many of you do for your land trust, land conservation work, is that we are losing forests and farmlands. In Connecticut, we're losing about 6,000 acres of forest every year. That's about 24,000 acres per year of forest that disappears across all of New England. In the next 50 years, that would be about the size of 2 Rhode Islands. Poor Rhode Island gets picked on a lot because of its size. It makes a really good unit of measure. But nevertheless, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about losing 2 Rhode Islands of forests over the next 50 years at the current rate of development. And we've all seen it. We all know what this looks like in our neighborhoods and places we go and recreate and visit. And so the wildlands and woodlands, farmlands and community vision, which I might call W&W or wildlands and woodlands for short, but it is inclusive of all of those things, is really a vision about protecting our landscape more or less the way it is now into the very distant future through permanent land protection. And so the vision calls for protecting 70% of the landscape in forests and another 7 to 14% in working farmland. And that still leaves plenty of room for doubling of development. So we could still double the footprint of development over the next few decades and still protect all this forest and agricultural land, and then ensure that we have that much in perpetuity. Now, within that forest, within the 70% of the forest that the vision calls for, it's mixed between working woodlands or woodlands for which you might manage for timber or you might not manage for timber. And then 10% of that is for wildlands, places we are never going to manage, places we're going to set aside in preserves, and we're going to let nature take its course. And each of these different kinds of protected forests have different benefits that are inclusive in the case of wildlands of lots of more permanent kinds of growth where timber harvest will never occur. At the same time, we as a society rely on all the products that come from managed forest lands. And so we don't want to exclude that across the whole landscape. Now, not all of these kinds of protections are appropriate in every place. Not all land trusts want to have working forest land. Not all land trusts want to preserve things and take away that economic opportunity. But collectively, when you look across the 300 or so land trusts across New England, when you look at all the work that all the land trusts, you and others are doing together, that's the kind of assemblage we're talking about that could achieve the wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities vision. And I should back up, if I'm able to, for a second, and say the wildlands and woodlands vision is really a big partnership of a lot of organizations. And it's really co-led by Highstead Foundation and the Harvard Forest, which is based in central Massachusetts and is a research center of Harvard University. But we have many partners in that, like the Northeast Wilderness Partnership and the New England Forestry Foundation and quite a few others as well.
Spencer, if you were to, just on that page, if you were to continue at the rate of development that we're at right now, you know where that is by 2060, it'd be a lot.
The rate of development now compared to the rate of protection?
Yeah, so I'm saying, you're saying we're 24,000 acres
Yeah.
here over New England. Do we know what that 11% will grow to if we did not do what we can to arrest that rate of development?
I couldn't give you an exact percentage, but if you wait a few more slides, I'm going to show you what it looks like on a map. There is a bit of a false equivalency, though, of thinking about the rate of development versus the rate of forest protection, because when you have a block of forest and you protect it, basically nothing happens. But you're sure that nothing will happen into the future. You don't lose that forest. You don't do anything to that forest. But when you convert a forest to housing or commercial, you change it usually forever. And so if you're losing forest at the same rate that you're protecting land, that's a losing battle over the long term. So I'm going to show you a map of what that looks like. So the New England Landscape Future Scenarios Project is led by our colleagues at the Harvard Forest. In particular, Jonathan Thompson leads this work. And I think if this is working correctly, you're seeing an animation of what 5 different scenarios of what the landscape looks like. So green is forest. We're 85% or so forested now. And the red are generally developed areas. And these different scenarios, these different scenarios grow and develop at different rates of time. This is projecting out 30 years worth of the past development trends. The one in the middle is the recent trends. That is what we would expect to happen, to your question, if things developed as they have been. The growing global scenario, and there's a lot of detail that we can talk about in the Q&A later if you're interested. The growing global scenario is sort of the most aggressive case of development, where our region becomes very attractive for development. We have low environmental regulation policies and things like that, and we end up with the most amount of forests converted. So here we have highlighted this region. There should be a dark outline, if you can make it out, around New Canaan. This is what it looks like right now. Red is areas that are developed, and green are areas that are protected. The yellow is farmland, or at least open lands. It could be meadows, but it's something that looks like agricultural land. And looking at the population trends, that this comes right out of your strategic conservation plan. We know that if those same development trends continue just as they are today for another, in this case, 40 years out to 2060, that's the shift that you might expect in the community. That's just the proportion of development that you might expect to come to the community if it's done the way it has been done, if it isn't done through smart growth, if it isn't done by protecting a lot of additional land that you all are working so hard on. In that worst case scenario, this is what it might look like. This, I believe, is a quadrupling roughly of the rate of development. So this is what at stake. This is why the work that you're doing to conserve the community in many ways is so important.
You think about the assumptions that are underlying global scenario, is that fostered by climate change and pushing population northwards and that concentration there?
That's a great question. So that is one of the many factors that goes into that. In fact, these scenarios were built with focus groups of stakeholders from all the different New England states. So actually several focus groups from each of the New England states. And people were asked questions like, when you look out to the year 2060, what do you see on the landscape? What are you concerned? And so like oil prices, for example, changes how far people want to live from their work. As oil prices go up, they want to have shorter commutes, for example. You try, when you do modeling scenarios like this, to include shocks to the system. This was done a few years during the pandemic. We're going to talk a bit about real estate prices later. That's not something that would have been that anybody predicted, right? That, of course, changes things as well. So there's a lot of sort of global exogenous factors that go into this, and then there's the basic population rates too.
To be clear, this was done pre-pandemic.
This work was done pre-pandemic. Yep.
Have you included changes in the zoning laws? Canaan has 4-acre zoning, which is most of the green on the map. The state may say 4-acre zoning is exclusionary and eliminate it.
So in one of the scenarios, Yankee Cosmopolitan, actually 2 of the scenarios, and community connectedness, the 2 on the top, both of those include smart growth kinds of principles where you do adjust your zoning to densify some areas so that when you have the same number of people that are living in a town, they take up less space. And in other places, you actually increase the zoning and don't allow development on the same thing. So those 2 scenarios will actually account for the kinds of things you're talking about. And that's part of why they end up converting less forest for the same number of people over time. Okay. So just over the last year, these are some data we compiled because at the beginning of COVID or several months into COVID, we were wondering about what were the COVID housing ramifications for the conservation community. And so these are some statistics for this metro area, Stamford, Bridgeport, Norwalk, and these several towns. And there's a 26% increase in building permits in those towns in 1 year, 26% increase in building permits. And there's a 20% increase in home value. And Aaron sort of alluded to that earlier. That makes it a lot harder to protect land. But as I think Art mentioned, it also creates opportunities when the dust settles. All right. So one of the ways that land conservation gets paid for is through philanthropy. Another way is through, state and federal grants. And there's a lot more of that expected in the near future with the Build Back Better bill and the infrastructure bill, one of which was just passed. The challenge is that philanthropy for the environment and conservation is actually a very small fraction of the overall philanthropy pie in the US. So there's about $428 billion of annual private donations made in the United States each year. And 3% is all that goes to all of the environment and animals category. And most of that goes to domestic animals category, pets kinds of stuff. So what we're talking about is having this big challenge on the landscape and funding it with a really small percent of the overall philanthropy pie. So that is one of the greatest challenges of doing conservation work. Now, when the stock market goes up, philanthropy tends to go up over time for the tax benefits associated with that. When people have a windfall and they can get a tax benefit associated with that, they tend to give more money over time. Here's a graph that shows as the S&P goes up, giving goes up as well. So that's a good news story. And if we had 2 more years of data on this graph, that curve would keep going up, as we probably all know. The challenge with there is that the overall percentage that we all give is less than 2% of disposable income. So that's of all philanthropy. That's not just the environment and conservation. So even as our resources as investors are going up and we are giving more of it, we are still giving a very small percentage of it. So that's kind of the funding landscape in which conservation organizations have to work over time. Now, you do have these sort of these one-off events or these actually increasing events where someone will give a huge amount of money to fight climate change or conservation. So Hans Wies, about a year and a half ago, agreed to give $1 billion over 10 years to fight climate change and do other conservation-related activities. Roxanne Quimby assembled over a decade or so, assembled a whole bunch of land in the state of Maine, and then decided to give much of it away to create a new national monument. Well, she wanted to create a national park. So far, it's become a national monument in Maine. At the same time, we see a lot of new corporate commitments coming, particularly now with COP26 happening in Glasgow. We see a lot of new corporate commitments coming around addressing climate change. So now is really the time. People are starting to take this seriously. There's new corporate money, there's new individual philanthropy money. And so the question is, how do you use that most effectively? How can you address some of these challenges most effectively? And I like to think about this from like a return on investment framework. But now we're talking about natural capital. We're talking about all the benefits that the landscape around us provides to us. The clean water, the clean air, the reduced flooding that we get, Aaron mentioned earlier, the carbon sequestration, recreation, wildlife habitat. These are all the things that sustain us economically, socially, mentally, and even our health. So for example, air quality. We know the region's forests were removing a really big number. It's hard to even know what does 760,000 tons mean, but it's a really big number of air pollutants in the region annually. That number is just for New England, even though the map shows a bigger area. Well, the economic benefit of that is $500 million a year associated with avoided health costs that we otherwise would have if we had worse air respiratory conditions. We're going to talk more about carbon in a minute, but the forests are as a natural climate solution because of the sequestration. From a climate perspective, we know that there's several different ways to increase the amount of carbon you sequester. This is a study widely cited now that is global, but reforestation is the most efficient way to do that. Avoided forest conversion, another way to say that is protecting land like you're doing here in New Canaan, is the second most effective and cost-effective way to do that. Now, reforestation in our region that is heavily forested as it is now is much less of an opportunity than avoiding additional conversion is. So you're in the sweet spot of producing natural climate solutions through conserving land that might otherwise be converted. We also know that storing more carbon in wooden buildings and innovative new ways of creating buildings, particularly large commercial buildings, out of more wood products and fewer concrete and steel is another way to support the forest products economy that is sequestering carbon, but also to store carbon in longer lived frameworks. And so we've taken on this study to really say, well, how big is this opportunity for New England? There are people out there that really want to focus on the wooden buildings, and there's other people that are focusing on producing wildlands. And so what we say to HISA with some of our colleagues is, well, how much is all of that? If we did all of those things over the next few decades, how big could that be? So we looked at avoided deforestation. We looked at converting more wildlands to places we will never harvest or touch, storing more wood in buildings, improving the kind of forest management we do. There's a lot that can be done with sustainable forestry methods to still harvest products, but store more and over the long term sequester more carbon in the forest. And also there's a lot of opportunities to sequester more carbon by adding green spaces to more urban areas that maybe have been depleted, but could have more forest put back in. So we're talking about things like street trees, but also new parks. And so when we do the math, and there's a whole lot of modeling that goes behind this that we don't have time to go into tonight, here's roughly what we're talking about. If you look at all those different categories, we're talking about 600 million tons CO2 equivalents over the next 30 years if we implemented all these different strategies. Now, that's just another big number. I realize it's like, what does 600 million CO2 equivalents even mean? And so let's look at it as a percentage of the emissions. So right now, the forests that we already have are sequestering about 16% of the emissions we're putting out from our region. So if you add up all the emissions we're putting out from our cities to our rural areas in New England, the forest is compensating for or sequestering already 16% of that. Now, that's not good enough because we have a big problem. And if all we did is rely on what we already have, we wouldn't make that problem any smaller. So if we implemented all those pathways, we could go from about 16% to about 25%, which seems like maybe not that big, but it's significant progress. Now, if you factor in all the other sectors, we all know about alternative energy and transportation and commercial sectors that are going to make the biggest difference. But when those things are all done over the next 30 years and the states have all met their goals and the country as a whole has met these transitional goals, we're still going to have our forests to rely on. So if we implemented all those pathways I just said, we would have about 25% of the emissions covered in today's emissions. But if we look at it after all those other emissions are reduced, now the forests are sequestering about 90% of the regional emissions. So if we're only looking short term at our opportunities, forests don't seem like that big of an opportunity. But if we're looking a little further out and we're saying, well, what are we going to be left with to be sequestering all that carbon after all the other things are done, like alternative energy, transportation, suddenly the forests look like a much more important investment to make. But of course, it's not just about the carbon. So I want to go back to some of those other things. We call those co-benefits. We're talking about human health, mental health, and physical health that we get from playing in these having access to these recreation and open spaces. The air quality, the water quality, the jobs that come from it. There are many parts of our region that are heavily natural resource dependent. Their entire economies rely on it, either for natural resource management or increasingly through tourism, open space and conservation related tourism. Think about in urban areas in particular, the shading effect of street trees. All of these things are important co-benefits that we rely on. It's funny you should ask that because I just listened to an interesting podcast about recycling old sailboats, fiberglass sailboats. Steve is a sailing friend of mine. And using it to replace some of the ingredients in concrete. And there's some estimates of how much difference that could make. So it's a huge emitter. It's a huge emitter. You can't replace all the concrete with things like wood. There are limits to what that can be done. The sweet spot for mass timber wooden buildings is probably in the 8 to 12 story range. So a lot of housing and small commercial development, retail kind of development is probably good space for it. Skyscrapers probably not going to happen. So
what's the biggest that we're seeing that people will go off to agree?
8 to 12 stories, and it has to do with the building code. So the biggest challenge for the people that work on this right now is showcasing how buildings can be made out of wood safely and fire resistant and still meet the code. So there's a lot of activity going on trying to actually change policies to allow those to happen. But we're starting to see more of these buildings in like institutional buildings, like universities and nonprofit buildings and headquarters and things like that, are these sort of custom built timber frames. But there's a lot of also link between the affordable housing investment community and wooden buildings as well. Those communities are starting to come together, working closer together. Let's talk about health for a minute. So we sort of take it for granted, many of us, that we have these pretty places to go recreate near our homes. Not everybody does. When I was a postdoc at Yale, when Aaron and I first met, I collaborated with some folks in the Yale School of Public Health, and we looked at people who have access over a 13-town area, including New Haven and many of the surrounding towns along Long Island Sound there. And what we found is that people who have access to open space within a 10-minute walk of them have lower rates of these diseases, hypertension, heart disease, and diabetes. And obesity was not quite statistically significant, but pretty close. So there's some question about that. But in any case, people have access to these places and therefore use these places, have lower rates of these diseases. And this is true across socioeconomic and demographics. So this is controlling for things like income and race and age and gender and all of that. And so if you have fewer rates of these diseases, you are less of a burden as a community on the healthcare system. So the hospitals have to pay for fewer uninsured people. Your insurance companies have to pay fewer benefits on your behalf. Your employers over the long term will get lower insurance premiums on your behalf because you're a healthier subpopulation within that pool of insurance. So when we looked at the economics of this, just in this region, we calculated this was worth $37 million per year in avoided healthcare costs. These are savings that the insurance and the healthcare industry overall is already not benefiting from just in this 13-town region. All right, let's talk about water for a minute. I put a couple of flyers from this initiative called Sebago Clean Waters out in the hall. This is a project that I work on very closely with many of our partners and other 9 organizations up in Maine. Sebago is a 300,000 acre watershed in Maine that supplies all the drinking water for about 1/6 of everybody that lives in the state of Maine. Well, that's because Maine is a rural state where most of the people live in the southeast and the greater Portland region. But all of them get their water from this lake and the tributaries that flow into this lake. How many people have been up in the Sebago region at summer camp when they were a kid? I meet so many people that spend time in Sebago. It's a wonderful place. So this is what we call a water fund. And at its core, it's about linking the people who own the land, own the forest land, and are keeping it healthy by virtue of owning it and stewarding it, with the people downstream who are drinking the water that comes from it. Because usually we turn on our tap and we don't really think about where our water comes from, and we have no idea who's on the other end of that pipe. Meanwhile, the person on the end of that pipe might live in a rural community with relatively low economic opportunities and doesn't have access to the same things that's downstream in Portland area. And so by bringing these communities together through land trusts, and we're working with the local community land trust in the upper watershed, and working with the businesses and the ratepayers, that's people who are paying for their drinking water downstream, by linking them together, we're creating this revolving economy, if you will, of money flowing upstream and clean water flowing downstream. We've done this by working very closely with the Portland Water District, who's been a leader in this for a long time. And the reason they're most interested is because their watershed, where they get their water, is so clean that they don't have to have a filtration plant. So you may be familiar with New York City's famous clean water that comes from the Catskills and elsewhere and doesn't need a filtration plant. Well, that is true also in Maine, in this part of Maine. So for the last several years, we've been bringing these people together. And just last year, we received an $8 million grant from the federal government through one of the Natural Resource Conservation Service Agency to take that money and now pay private landowners to protect their land through conservation easements so that they can keep that forest healthy and clean to keep sending the drinking water downstream. All right, let's talk briefly about environmental justice. I saw Aaron had a couple of points in there about recognition more now than ever about we don't all have access to the same kinds of benefits from the land. Many of us live in these great places, and we maybe have neighboring communities that have less access to it. And one study that comes out of the Trust for Public Land, who has a really impressive program on this topic in particular, shows that parks that serve people of color are half as large on average and 5 times as crowded as people as non-people of color have access to over time. And so there are a lot of ways of a lot of different groups that have begun to map the inequity in access to protected lands and open space and recreation areas over time. And my colleagues at the Harvard Forest and Amherst College have produced this New England-wide environmental justice map that does just that. It starts mapping the way we might do conservation priorities, except now they're mapping disparity between who has access to high quality recreation open space and places that don't. And what they found are all these areas in yellow, and they go up into northern New England too, but I had to cut them off for the slide. And what you can see, these yellow areas are essentially spots where a very low percentage of people have access to a lot of the very kinds of places that we're talking about protecting. So one of the reasons I bring this up is because you're working in a landscape, and you're also working, New Canaan Land Trust is working through a regional conservation partnership called the Hudson to Housatonic Initiative that maybe some of you are directly involved in yourselves and that have heard of, that is helping land trusts across communities and state agencies and other nonprofits work across boundaries and thinking about who's protecting what where and how collectively that provides a landscape of conservation. All right, let's talk about jobs for a couple of minutes. So often when I talk to land trusts and community members, there's a concern about, well, land protection is really great, but it costs us a lot. We lose money in taxes. And if you build fewer homes, there's fewer jobs in our community. And we heard these sort of depressed economic arguments sometimes against conservation. And when some towns vote to approve new bonds to actually have town money available to pay for land protection, there often are people that use these economic arguments to say, yeah, we probably shouldn't do that. It's not fiscally responsible. So a group of colleagues and I for the last few years have been really trying to dig into some of these questions. And I know Aaron's very familiar. We've talked about this before, but there's this idea of cost of community services surveys that show land that is protected costs the town less, right? Because you don't have more kids that live on it. So you don't need additional schools. And maybe you don't need as many fire trucks or firemen because you don't have as many people living on it. And so the idea is that developed land actually costs a lot more in taxes to steward and manage that land within your town. There are two sides to that story for sure. But so we started digging in this a little deeper and we said, well, is there any evidence that protecting more land across towns actually reduces the number of jobs in towns? And so Kate Sims, the chair of the economics department at Amherst College, a colleague of ours, is really good at doing these economic studies, where what she has taught us is that if you look across many, many towns, you can do these studies and show these statistical effects that you could never do if you just looked in your own community. And what we found when we looked across all of the organized towns across all of New England is that we actually found a very small but meaningful increase in the number of jobs on average in towns that have higher rates of land protection. So in a 5-year period, if a town protects an additional 10 to 15% of their community, you could expect a 1.5% increase in the number of people employed in that community in the 5 years after. So this is an actual causal relationship. This is not just a correlation. So for a town with about 20,000 people, if you did that, you might expect 300 additional jobs. People immediately ask me, like, what are you talking about? How can that be, right? Land trusts have a staff of 2.5, that we just heard earlier. Aaron, do you want 297 more jobs in the organization? There's a lot of answers to this question, and it varies by region. If you're in a rural area where, like the White Mountain National Forest, for example, the answer has a lot to do with ecotourism jobs, guide services, outdoor retailers, more hotels, more gas stations. The White Mountain National Forest, the Forest Service itself, all the rangers associated with that, all the local nonprofits that are associated with it. If you live in a place more like New Canaan or like where I live in Guilford, the answer has more to do with the quality of life. People are attracted to these communities. People want to come and live here because you have beautiful open spaces and art walks on some of your preserves and things like that. So there's a different answer depending upon where you are, but nevertheless, across the entire region, we were very surprised and pleasantly surprised to see that there's actually an increase in the number of jobs, a small but meaningful increase. All right, what about taxes? This is the most common one. How many people here assume your taxes go up when you spend money on land, and then the people that own the land often don't pay taxes? No one thinks that. I'm preaching to the choir here, right? But trust me, most people think that's true. So this work is I should say hot off the press, except it's not yet published. It's almost published, but this is really exciting work that we think is going to be important for the entire land trust community throughout the region. What we found is a very small increase in the amount of tax. So we did this study across the same number of towns. So all of the towns, all the organized towns across all of New England. So very rural areas, very densely urban areas. And what we found is a very small increase. When you protect an additional amount, 1% of land, you might expect $1.94 increase in the tax rate in your community. So that is only true for the first 3 to 5 years. So there is a small increase, but it is fleeting. It gets absorbed into the tax system within just a few years. And so this is not a perpetual increase over time. And that has to do with the fact, again, that it increases the values of our homes. It increases the sale price of our homes, and that the grand list that we all are part of that own homes in our communities has absorbed that effect over time through the increased value in our homes. Now, an example of that, and I know this example won't exactly resonate here, but I'll give you a different number in a minute, but the median home price across all of New England is $266,000. Just bear with me for a minute. I know that's quaint. Who is asking how much you need to raise to buy new headquarters? So I'm using New England averages here, so bear with me. But if a town over the period of this analysis protected an additional 85 acres, a median value home, its taxes might only go up $1.94 per year. That's it. That's the cost to the average homeowner. Now, I asked the lead scientist colleague on this study this morning, could you tell me what that would be for $1.5 million home? Because according to Zillow, that's the median home price in New Canaan about now. And he said, it's about $10, $10.37, I think it was. So yeah, it's 5 times as big, but it's still a really small number. That's the cost. And remember, that is fleeting. That only lasts for up to about 3 years on average across New England. All right. So as I mentioned at the start, I spent a bunch of time going through the really well done strategic plan that you all have. And I saw so many interesting things in there. I saw the goal of protecting additional 400 acres, which I think is about a doubling of the protection that you have. And that is a really exciting goal because that's the kind of thing we are excited when we see across New England, because as I said, if we ever are going to reach this 70% goal, it's going to take between a doubling and a tripling of the pace of conservation to do it. So when we hear and talk with an organization, a land trust that has that goal already in mind, we get really excited about that. And as you think about the planning and the priorities on the landscape that you want to protect, I want you to be thinking not only about the critters that we all know, but of many of these other things. And I heard a lot of that reflected in the remarks already about some of the benefits of the work you're doing. So I've never been here. Watson Symington, is this one of your best places? Is this a good one?
Yes.
All right. So I look at that and you can see the effect, right? Look at all the homes ringing that. Look at all the people that want to live next to this piece of property. How many people have read a real estate listing? And if it's next to a piece of property, the first person to know the value of that is the real estate agent, right? Because they always put in the listing. It always says, next to open space or next to preserved land, or your neighbor can never build another home or whatever they say. But realtors are the first people to know the value of the open space. And a picture like this shows that effect on the land. So I want you to be thinking about when you do that, when you protect the next one of these preserves, how that scales up across all of New England. And forgive me that I don't have your other neighbor, New York, on this map that's closer to you, admittedly. But I want you to think about how that scales up across an entire region and indeed across the entire globe, because this is the system in which you're working. Everything you do here locally is having an impact on these global cycles. One of the things we do, everything we do is through collaborations and networks. You probably could gather that by the way I talked about a lot of people's work tonight. We work in partnership almost exclusively. And one of the things we do every year is we bring groups, land trusts, and other conservation NGOs and agency representatives together in this thing we call the gathering, the RCP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Gathering. And it happens once a year. And this is I think our 13th year. And we normally would have it in person. We're doing it remote again, but it's happening next Thursday. And so if anything I said here resonates with you, or more importantly, if the idea of doing more of what you're doing towards the Wildlands and Woodlands goal resonates with you, this is the community of people outside of your town that is talking about this and is working together and collaborating on how to work on this and increase your scale. There's groups of people that want to focus on the fundraising. There's people that want to focus on the environmental justice. There's people that want to focus on how to get more of the federal funding in particular. There's people that want to focus on the natural climate solutions angle of all of this. So it's a really wonderful community. It's usually in the 300 to 500 people. It's on Zoom, so it's going to be accessible to everybody. And I would encourage you to attend. And putting a link on the screen wouldn't mean much because it's a long link. But if you Google RCP Network Gathering 2021, the first thing that comes up will be our page to learn more about it, get the agenda, and register for it. So I hope some of you will join us. I will close with that and say thank you to all of you for your attention this evening. And I'm excited to hear more about what you're interested in. Yes, sir.
Can I ask a question about what you think of the reforestation of farmland? I mean, it strikes me that we live in a region that's naturally suited for forests. And from a national perspective, I'm wondering if other areas that are suited for farmland are suited for forestation.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, which doesn't have a short answer. But what I'll say is what I didn't talk about much tonight is the farmland component of the wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities. So several years ago, one of our colleagues, Brian Donahue, who actually was an undergraduate advisor to Aaron, yet another connection with Aaron at Brandeis, wrote with a bunch of colleagues something called the New England Food Vision. And it laid out a plan to be able to produce half of all the food that we New Englanders need. It laid out a plan. What would it take to produce half of all of our food in the region? And it was a land analysis and economic analysis of what that would look like. So when I showed that early graph of the wildlands and woodlands vision, that chart that expands over time, that 7 to 14% that should be conserved as permanent farmland, those numbers come directly from the New England Food Vision. So the upper limit of that 14%, I believe, is the number Brian and all the other colleagues came up with. If we had 14% of the landscape in productive farmland with modern sustainable practices, we could produce half of the food in New England. So internally with our group, you can imagine a lot of spirited discussions between the foresters and the farmers about which acre gets to be which. Like when we're doing land use modeling, you get to play around with other people's land, right? It doesn't matter. But when push comes to shove, there's a lot of economic forces at play here. So the local agriculture movement really needs to expand significantly before that can happen. And it is beginning to in many ways. If we instead say this really ought to be forest because that's the kind of soils it is, and this part of the country ought to be agriculture, you start getting into a lot of the sort of commodity agricultural downsides and environmental damage associated with that. So I know that wasn't a very satisfying answer, but I think there is a lot more opportunity within the region to produce more food and balance out some of the forest lands.
Spencer, thanks for your presentation. Really nice.
Good.
I have a question about on your old chart you had that showed, this looked like, skyrocketing chart of protected lands versus wildlands, way below that. What's your definition of protected?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking.
Can you just repeat the question for the folks?
Sure. Yeah. So this question, the last question was about should we, just going back for a minute for those that couldn't hear. The last question that I answered was about whether we should consider where the farmland should be, maybe in a different part of the country if our region is so well naturally suited to growing trees. And my answer was, well, it's pretty well suited for agriculture too. And it was longer than that, but that was the gist. This question is about what do we even mean by protected land? And what did my graph really show when I said 70% of the region should be protected as forest land? 10% of that should be specifically wildlands where we don't ever manage it. Yes, that's the question? Okay. So what we generically mean by protecting land is don't convert it to houses, don't convert it to parking lots, don't convert it to commercial buildings, don't convert it to utility corridors, things like that. So you don't permanently deforest it. Now, managed forest, even if it's a clear cut that may look ugly, is not deforestation. That was not totally protected. No. So at its most basic sense, when I say protected, I mean either a conservation easement or owned by an organization that is not going to convert it to a developed use in the future. Within that, there's a lot of variation. There's everything from forever wild easements or forever wild property that nobody can touch. There are even places where you can only walk in it and you can't do other kinds of recreation. Those are forever wild easements. And then there's a whole big category called working lands or working forest lands or working farmlands where it is protected from being developed, but it is not protected from active management because we all need wood products and we all need food products and such things. So the wildlands component of that was the portion that will never be managed and will never be harvested. And the reason it's a small percentage, we could debate whether it should be 10% or 20% or 7%. We're only at 3% right now, so we have a long way to go before we need to argue over what number it should be. But we do know that a much smaller percentage of landowners are willing to do that than are willing to protect their land. Not everyone is willing to give up all the economic opportunity associated with managing their land for forest or farm.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. It's that from an ecological standpoint, because if you start allowing disturbances in the land anywhere, you're changing the ecology of the land. So,
You are changing it. They're not all downsides. There are upsides and there are downsides to managed areas. But more importantly than that is that we can have this vision and say what could be, but we don't get to say what should be because we don't own all the land. And so our goal as a coalition initiative is to have everybody that wants to manage and conserve their land in one way or another to find themselves in this vision. And so if we said it should all be permanently wildlands, that would shut out the vast majority of people out there that own big tracts of land, but maybe don't want to convert it, but they don't want to stop harvesting trees either. And so it's a balanced vision that really is meant to have something in it for a lot of types of landowners throughout the region. Yeah.
Also, I just with my forestry background, there's a significant ecological benefit to forest management done properly and thoughtfully. There's this great program called Foresters for the Earth, which I think Audubon's a part of. They're trying to get people to cut forests because we have so much mature forests in New England. We don't have a lot of really successional forests. And there's countless bird species that need that young forest to be able to survive. And so we don't really have the scale to be able to do much of that in the kingdom. But there are certainly places where that's beneficial, and it also provides landowners with economic returns on their land. And it can be built better, but maybe less impactful on the land management. Maybe a trigger that might not be allowed under the wild easement.
But that's a great example. A Canada lynx is another example of a critter that eats snowshoe hare, and the snowshoe hare live in regenerating clear cuts in northern Maine and northern New Hampshire. And so, if you want to keep a relatively high population of the threatened but not endangered Canada lynx, you need to keep some of that management on the landscape. So there really are a lot of critters that thrive in that kind of ecosystem.
I just like that comment for you about affecting the environment. I logged about 40 acres of our farm just across the border in Massachusetts 5 years ago. And we now have a successional forest understory. And I have game cameras set up. The number of bear, bobcat, coyotes, even porcupines, rabbits, turkeys, incredible. The ecological benefit of selectively cutting 40 acres of old forest is tremendous. It absolutely amazes me, the beneficial impact of selectively logging 40 acres, which is a small forest.
Yes, the Navy Blazer.
So if we look at your map, New England as a whole, as opposed to 5-6 acres in the Canaan, a problem. To what extent are these things like Dutch-Hill disease and ash borer, which are decimating trees, certainly one a problem for looks at your picture and what you find?
Yeah, those things are problems throughout the region. Right, thank you. The question is about invasive species, and a few specific ones were mentioned, and whether the invasive species we see in our own backyards and back 40 woodlots, whether they have an impact across the whole region. And the short answer is yes, they absolutely do. They are always evolving. There are always new ones cropping up that we don't know much about. The beech leaf disease. So many of us are familiar with the beech bark disease. We've been hearing about for years. We've been seeing the cankers on the beech trees. A relatively new one that's cropped up that we're learning more about is the beech leaf disease that, you'll know it when you see it because it changes dramatically the leaves, the veins in the leaves. Yes, these things are changing across the landscape. And when we did those future models, those future land use scenarios, the question about invasive species came up a lot and didn't really end up, there wasn't really much to model because what we've learned over time is that they don't tend to erase forests, they tend to change the forest. So the hemlock woolly delegate, for example, is a common one in this part of the state. And it's not that the hemlock die away and no trees go back. Different trees, like black birch, for example, commonly comes back. And so it changes the ecology of the forest and it changes the structure and the succession of the forest, but it doesn't erase the forest. And so we could talk a lot about whether the forest that grows back is ecologically diverse or as beneficial as the one that was there. But from the broad perspective, there is still forest. Yeah. And the gentleman next to you had a question.
I just had a question whether the coalition is doing anything to promote or try to direct some of the ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act funds that are going into different towns and regions and states towards open space or towards public space preservation.
The question was about whether ARPA, American Recovery and Protection Act funds, if we're doing anything to promote their use related to conservation open space. Boy, the way you asked that question makes me think we need to work together, because just in the last few weeks, I've been having a lot of conversations about that very question, because as the infrastructure bill was voted on Friday, and as the Build Back Better bill is hopefully going to be voted on before Thanksgiving, there is a lot of money in there for all the kinds of stuff I was talking about. One of the challenges of these federal funding programs, you usually cannot use, they all require match, usually 2-to-1 match. You can't use other federal programs to match other federal programs, usually. I'm told, I understand that ARPA is one of the few exceptions to that. So if your community has decided, and I don't know that many have, but a lot of people are asking the same question you just asked, if your community decides to deploy some of their ARPA funding towards conservation and open space alongside schools and technology and other things, that is a great opportunity to use that to match other bigger federal dollars that are out there. So I don't really have an answer for you of who's doing that yet, other than a lot of colleagues in the organization are all starting to discuss that. But it's a great opportunity, and I'm glad you're asking that question. Yeah. Yes.
Great presentation. And it's an amazing and wonderful collection of very persuasive arguments across socioeconomic lines that put that conservation. But have studies been done by the same group about who to direct these messages to, to have the most impact, to make a difference, to start implementing some of these changes? Planning and development board, is it the citizenry at large? It's who has the greatest sway in implementing these good ideas.
It's a very important question. The question is, are we really talking to the right audience, or do we need to figure out who has influence and doesn't already agree with us? Is that a fair representation of your question? It's a good one, because you've all drank the Kool-Aid already, right? You're here supporting your land trust, and you already agree probably with much of what I said and think it's great. So it's easy to talk to you because you smile and nod sometimes at me. Yeah. So if I instead were up here talking about just the critters or just the ecology, which I could have done, I would worry more about that. But what I think you can see we're starting to do is broaden the arguments to say, like, is it actually affecting our taxes or not? Taxes is not like that cool of a topic for conservationists to talk about. But it turns out that's one of the real things that keeps towns from voting bonds to spend more of their own money to do, is because they all think their taxes are going to go up if they do it. And so if we start broadening the research and broadening the arguments, now we can go to other people and say, we're scientists. We ask these questions unbiased and genuinely. And here's what we found. And here's the articles we publish them in. And now we think we can appeal to a broader audience. So now I need help. My colleagues and I all need help going and identifying those other people that maybe were skeptics, maybe are not all as into this as you are, but something like that can speak to. Out on the table out there, I put a stack of these little blue and white briefs that we produced a year or so ago that give a snapshot of some of these more economic kinds of arguments for that exact reason, because some of the partners in the Hudson to Housatonic RCP that Aaron is part of were asking that very question. They wanted to be able to go to their local commissioners and local economic development people and have the same conversation. So we put out these briefs for that exact purpose. So if you know those people, I'm happy to go talk to them too, even if they won't say as many nice things as you do.
I'm not really sure where I'm going with this comment, but one of the other events we did as a land trust was to host Film Kids.
Yeah.
And that was prior to the last one that Mark slide with Doug Talley. And so, his picture is big, right? So it's about the cutting the skin off at the head and, telling all these institutions to stop investing in fossil fuel. And it's happening, it's happening.
Yeah.
But I think, and then I was at another conference where people were talking about climate grief. And I think we have a lot of climate grief in our population of people who are like us, but also people who don't even know where to start. And I guess what I'm asking or suggesting is simply, is there a way to kind of like distill it down in a really digestible format for people to understand, like, how they can do it and what it means? Everything you're talking about, from the $10 a month in your property taxes to the cutting off your institutional investing to fossil fuels. But, I think there's a lot of smart people around, and, they just don't know where to start.
Yep.
So, it's not really even a question, it's simply a statement, like, how can we harness all of this information and make it digestible and to,
Yeah, I just to repeat, I think the question or statement was, how did we get from Bill McKibben to Doug Talmy to you? I think that was the question. No, just kidding. I didn't take it that way. I think it's a great point. I know. I'm just joking with you. It's a great point. I mean, different messages speak to different people, right? There's people that only talking about the capital markets will convince. And what we're seeing in the capital markets is less investment is going into fossil fuel companies and more investment is going into climate tech. And what we see is more of these big corporates are having climate commitments right now this week in Glasgow. And so little by little, the capital markets are starting to change. So that's an answer for that crowd, is the capital market speaks to them. I think another answer is like, be the change you want to see in the world, right? What you all are doing at your local community level is influencing your neighbors. And the solar panels you put up on your house, there's a very strong empirical link between neighbors that put up solar panels because they saw their neighbors do it. This is true of electric cars. There's a well-known dynamic that is happening, that they spread by people seeing each other in their neighborhoods. And so you need to lead by example. So for some people, it's leading by example. For me, I live just about 150 feet vertical from Long Island Sound, but like a quarter of a mile linearly. And so our road floods a couple times a month. And I was on a jog a couple days ago at a very high tide, and I couldn't keep going because the road was flooded. I had to ask a driver in a truck to pull over and let me get in his truck and drive 100 feet with him so I didn't have to get my running shoes soaking wet, right? When some people have that kind of experience, that starts to convince them that, oh boy, it's real, it's happening, it's right here, I need to start doing things. So all that to say, I think there's a lot of different messages, all succinct, that we need to be able to deliver. And some organizations deliver the chop the head off one. Bill McKibben and others are making that argument really effectively. Some are making the capital markets argument. And so I think we need all of those messages to make progress.
Just a quick question, not that's on the market. Have you had a lot of success convincing private folks to donate upstream to that, or is that a mandated thing, or how is it that you're actually effective?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So the primary mechanism through which it happens is the water district itself, the water utility, Portland Water District. Even before we created this project, they already were collaborating with land trusts and they were contributing money to individual land protection projects. They were doing this. This is in their DNA because they care that much about it. They just sort of get it. Not all water utilities get it. I recognize that. We built this program because we had the water utility that got it. It was like, okay, if you can do this anywhere, this is where to do it. So they are willing to pay up to 25% of the cost of a land protection project, depending upon a bunch of criteria. So that's the first way. I think I already said that. The next way is by going to the business community and saying, like, look at this cool thing we're doing. Look at how we're connecting you employer down here in Portland with many of the places that your employees live, or they recreate, or they like to go visit on the weekend, or they go fishing, or maybe they're into hunting, or maybe they're into trail running or whatever. Look at how we're connecting what you do and what your corporate sustainability program does. We originally went in with what we thought was the business proposition of, if this watershed declines in health and they have to build a $150 million treatment plant, your water costs will go up, and we've calculated it all. And you know what? A really big increase in a really small number turns out not to matter. If their water bill was $150,000 a year and it doubled, it's still only $300,000, which for a big company is decimal dust. So that argument didn't work, but many of the others about connecting to the landscape and their employees and being a good steward does.
And so when you think about the actual commitments that they make back, is it everything from actual dollars to programs to volunteer time, what have you? And it's just what you guys are doing is working with each of those businesses in terms of understanding how it is that you get that circle closed.
That's exactly right. So some of them are brilliant social media marketers, right? And so their best utility to us is spread the word about what we're doing on their Instagram account. And that's all we might get from one partner, and it's really good. Another partner was a national brewery, still a small beer in the grand scheme of things, but it has a national presence. They said, we'll give you 10 cents for every barrel of beer we produce. Like, that's a really good marketing thing. They tell their customers that 10 cents per barrel of brew adds up significantly over the course of a year. That goes into our water fund. We then send it to Land Trust and pay staff and all that to do these projects. Lunch by the Maine Beer Company. No, but the Maine Beer Company has a relationship with Maine Coast Heritage Trust, which is a big organization on the coast in particular. So that particular brewery is engaged in another way, not ours. That's Allagash. Another one, Bissell Brothers produce really nice water bottles for us and to sell to their customers. And they have a special water spigot that looks like a beer tap in their tap room. I think there's a picture of it, right? And they put our logo on it and they give us some proceeds from the sale of those. In next week, we are going to, Sevier Clean Waters is going to be recognized at a game of the Maine Celtics, which used to be called the Red Claws. They're like a farm team for the Boston Celtics. And a portion of the proceeds from all the people in the stadium that night are going to go to Sevier Clean Waters. That's their way of doing it. So it goes on and on. But to answer your question, yes, it's about figuring out what's useful to them and what they can offer us collectively and how we can work out a partnership. And sometimes it's dollars, sometimes it's volunteers. Yeah.
Can you remind us what portion of New England land is orange effect?
Oh, I didn't say that. I skipped that number, 26%. Yeah. So it varies a lot by state. New Hampshire has the White Mountain National Forest and, is a really big number. And Maine is 3%. I should know Connecticut. I think it's 16%. From development. Back to your same question. That is all kinds of protection. If you ask me how much is in wildlands in each state, no. No, it's not. It's not wildlands. It's protected from development, from conversion development. In a place like Maine, there are several million acres of forest protected, but most of that is working industrial forest. Yeah, former paper. They're not owned by paper companies anymore. Sort of one exception, but yeah. Yep. I lived and worked in Maine for a long time, so if you want to talk about that subject, that's one of my favorite subjects. I think we're supposed to wrap up.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining, and thanks to our virtual audience here. Have a wonderful evening.